Hey guys, welcome into the Puggo Reborn channel. Today we're going over the next perk in the perk guide in the tier 2 column, Executioner. As I go into my deep analysis, guys, the roundtable has been moved to a different section so that way people can watch two different experiences. This is going to be a deep analysis. Everything you want to know about this perk is going to be in this video. So without further ado, let's get into Executioner. As always, we got to look at the description of Executioner. It says, inflicts additional 20% damage against a target that has sustained any injury effects like a broken arm. Pretty simply put, if an enemy is injured and you go to attack them and you hit them, it's a 20% extra damage buff to the weapon that you use. But I can't end the video right there. Look at it like this. 20% of any weapon is every 5 points of damage, you're getting 1 extra point. So if you look at a fighting axe has 35 to 55 damage. If an enemy's injured and you pull a 35 damage against an enemy, you're going to actually do 7 extra damage, which ultimately ends up being 42 damage. If you end up hitting on the high end at 55, you're effectively gaining 11 extra damage at 66 total damage. While it's pretty easy to remember 5 equals plus 1, you have to also remember that if you roll a 4, 3, 2, or 1, you're always going to round down. It has to be a solid 5 in order to get that plus 1. So at 54, it would be 10 extra damage, not 11. Speaking of damage and modifying that, it does stack with Killing Frenzy. That's 25 extra damage. As you can see on the screen there, that stacking together does 45 extra percentage of damage. The other big thing to know in terms of the damage is the fact that even though they're injured, you'd almost assume that you're doing more hit point damage. The truth is you're doing extra damage across the board when it comes to armor and hit points. And finally, the big thing you need to understand about this perk is that debuffs like Dagger Bleed, Poison, Daze, any of those type of things, if it's not actual injuries, it does not count and it will not proc in that way. With that metric out of the way, now let's get into the Kryptonite. Making this as simple as possible, there are 2 charts. You have the one side that ends up being immune to injuries, and you have the other side who has really high hit points that makes it very difficult to cause injuries in the first place. This is important because the one side has enemies that are ultra late game enemies, and you can't do extra damage to them. This affects other areas that we'll talk about in a bit. But on the other side, you have the high hit points that are very difficult to cause injury. You would either need a really high damage dealing weapon with ignoring armor at that, or you would need crippling strikes to help mitigate the issue of causing injuries. This is why it's technically a Kryptonite, is because not all enemies are created equal, and you have to understand that when picking Executioner. The second Kryptonite is on par with number 1 and kind of a flip of the script. It's ultimately low hit point enemies. If you hit a low hit point enemy like a goblin, you're going to do 50% damage all the way up to 100%, which is killing them, right? But when you hit 50% threshold, it's impossible for you not to cause an injury. So if you cause an injury on them, is Executioner going to be the reason in the second shot that you kill that enemy? The answer is no. And that is the unfortunate thing about this perk thus far, is that it doesn't really create a good synergy with low hit point units. Unfortunately as well, you're going to have competing perks, which brings me to my next one, Killing Frenzy. Killing Frenzy is a perk that procs when you kill an enemy, you get 25% extra damage every time you strike something for 2 turns. Now, if you kill something within those 2 turns, it reprocs it to start over. It doesn't stack, but it only procs. This is a problem because if things are a lot easier to kill, like goblins, then you're always going to proc this. If you kill a thug, a little lonely thug, you're going to get that proc of 25% extra damage. This is going to be, in theory, more effective than Executioner that can't work on enemies that cannot be injured or have too much hit points to get that injury, or too little of hit points for Executioner to matter. Another Kryptonite could be Berserk. Berserk, ultimately, when you kill something, you get an extra 4 AP to take another strike or to move, whatever the case may be. The reason why this is important is because it's assuming that you're killing something and then going to strike something else. Now, in order for Executioner to work, it can't be a kill and it has to be an injury, which means that if you kill something, you have to assume that the other enemy has an injury for it to matter when you strike. Again, this is very situational. You could have archers that hit something, or somebody else hits them, boom, he's injured, and Berserk works out great. But for the most part, if you're just looking at the two together in comparison, the one is going to be more effective than the other in theory. The final thing that makes this more of a Kryptonite is the difference between pulling a pin on a grenade and rubbing a genie lamp and saying a certain amount of words in order for the genie to come out and grant you 3 wishes. It's the idea that you have to do certain things in order to cause Executioner to work. And when I say certain things, it's having a weapon that causes injuries, having somebody else to cause these injuries, assuming that that guy is going to be attacking people with injuries in general. There's definitely a synergy that is there, don't get me wrong, but there is a specific setup that you need to do, which became a trend throughout the Kryptonite section. The bad comes the really good, and that is where we jump into synergies. The first synergy, hands down, is definitely Crippling Strikes. It ultimately lowers the threshold of injuries by 33%, both by melee and range attacks. This is massive because more injuries means more proccing of that 20% extra damage. Definitely goes hand in hand. So I have to play devil's advocate with this next one. You have yourself the enemies that have no way of causing injuries to them. You have the low hit point enemies that you can cause injuries to, but it doesn't really matter because the next strike's going to kill them anyways. But the really high end hit point enemies have trouble with this perk, because if you are able to cause injuries on these big bastards, you're able to cause more damage to them, killing them a lot faster, which you need to do with a lot of these enemies, especially when it comes to white on holds or even Linworms. This brings me to my next point, which is taking on the mid-tier hit points. We're talking about 100 hit points up to 300 hit points. That's the beauty of this perk. That's where you're getting the most utilization, because a lot of times you're able to cause those injuries, whether it's light or heavy injuries. It's very devastating to the opponent. You're killing them much faster. You're causing more debuffs because that does stack and causes more injuries quickly. And we're talking about Berserkers, we're talking about Orc Warriors, Reavers, Chosen, Champions, everything in between. And even on top of that, you might be able to cause an injury on a Nimble Bro. Nonetheless, great synergy. That's where it shines the most. I didn't have a trait section, but there are traits that I want to just compile together real quick so that you can understand where Executioner comes in really strong. Brute is a trait that gives you a 15% extra chance to hit the head. While you do have a -5 to your melee skill, providing it's on the right brother, this can be incredible. The fact that you hit somebody's head, giving them a 50% extra damage boost, this is going to cause injuries faster, which makes your brother proc Executioner faster. Drunkard is a fantastic perk to pair with Executioner, mainly because you're getting a plus 10% extra damage boost. Now, this is before Executioner is applied, and when it is applied, it's a bit of a yo-yo in terms of damage, but ultimately you're getting that 30% quotation marks of damage when you hit something. This is great before and after, definitely a good pairing. Being a chungus of a boy never hurt anybody. Being huge is even better. The fact that you have an extra 10% damage is great, and it pairs the same way that you would expect Drunkard to as well. In terms of ranged weapons, it's very deadly. You're talking about warbows, crossbows, throwing weapons, and the handgun even. As long as there's exposed skin or you're hitting through the armor with especially crossbows, it's so devastating. It can happen very easily with orcs. You can cause mass injuries. Doesn't matter what weapon it is, as long as there's exposed skin. As I said, very, very dangerous and can be set up for ultimate devastation. Now, if we shift that to the front of the line, pretty much all of your frontliners being ready for an enemy to crash into them is going to get a boost, because if everybody's injured before they hit the line, you're going to be able to capitalize on that extra 20% damage. This also applies for your brothers in the back line with pole arms or any other unique tactic that you're using, just because a lot of times they're already going to be injured based on your frontline or your ranged units. While there is the unfortunate setup of causing an injury, there's one weapon that stands above the rest, and that would be the dagger. See, a dagger has a chance to attack 2 times, but when you get the mastery, it brings the AP level down to a 3 AP, which means you can strike 3 times. Most of your daggers are able to use the ability Puncture. When you use Puncture, you are doing pure hit point damage. You pair this with Executioner. The first strike is usually an injury every time. If you don't believe me, ask a goblin. They're douchebags. It sucks. So again, when you use daggers, you can get that extra 20% on top of the pure damage you're already doing. I wanted to leave a special little category for strange mushrooms. Yes, strange mushrooms are rough on your defense, but oh boy, does it not make your damage output that much stronger. You get a 25% bonus to your damage output. My God, this is dangerous. We talked about turn order a lot in some other perks, and this one is no different. Ultimately, brothers who fall farther in the turn order have a better chance to proc this, because all of the brothers before him can cause the injuries and he can mop them up. One weapon that works really well with Executioner definitely has to be spears, spectrums, etc. The idea of being able to use a spear wall, the enemy running in, causing injuries, that damage does get added to the spear wall itself. While we're dying down on the synergies, there is some more to go over with the perk combos, but first I want to address a big issue with the community. Disclaimer, everything I talk about is going to be looking at it from both sides of the aisle. The first issue is the legendary locations, whether it be the Monolith, the Kraken, or the Sunken Library. On one hand, you have enemies that are immune to injuries, which makes a lot of sense. It's a dead perk when it comes to these big fights. On the flip side though, this perk is allowing your brother to gain exponential XP by killing more enemies over a longer period of time. When you use this perk, you are scaling faster. Some would argue in the same way that you would argue for gifted, being able to boost your stats can be more viable than just simply having the perfect perks. This is for the user to decide what really matters. You can defeat the Monolith with Executioner, even if it's not being in use during that fight. But there are better perks for these fights. The next big issue the community brings up is the inconsistency of injuries. You a lot of times will hear from big time YouTubers that it's trash because it's inconsistent, and you'll have community head members who say no, it's about the numbers. With it taking a fair stance in the middle, it is the truth that numbers matter. If you go to my crippling strikes video, I break down exactly the numbers you need to understand when you're going to proc an injury. These numbers are set in stone. It is not fluctuating based on I hit the numbers but it didn't work. Truthfully, it is based on the numbers. If you don't have a high enough roll on a hit, then you will not cause an injury. A lot of people focus on the percentage chance to hit and say I hit the enemy and it was a lot of damage, so I should proc an injury. Again, the truth is you have to hit a threshold in order to cause this injury. The next grand debate within the community about Executioner is whether or not it has to be paired with crippling strikes. The truth is, on both sides of the argument, one side, yes, crippling strikes does cause injuries much easier, and especially with even heavier weapons causing those really heavy injuries is very nice. But the truth is, if you have a damage output that is consistent with a named weapon or a high damage weapon in general, for instance a two-handed mace, then Executioner can thrive on its own. There are truly two sides of this coin. It comes down to personal preference and pure damage output if you're not using crippling strikes. Finally guys, the perk combos. Of course, the best perk synergy has got to go to crippling strikes. As just debated with the community, the big thing here is that you're being able to lower that threshold, causing injuries much easier, and with the right weapon, it is going to be dangerous. This is going to drive people crazy, but Killing Frenzy comes in at number 2, and definitely because they stack together in terms of that damage output. But the reason that became a Kryptonite is because of the fact that a lot of times you're choosing between the two, and one is definitely more appealing than the other. But paired together, ho ho ho, get ready for a mega killer. There's a lot of good perks to choose from here at number 3, but I gotta give it to Headhunter. When you hit the head, it guarantees the next hit, providing that you do hit the enemy, it will be another headshot. So imagine hitting the head once, causing a 50% critical damage, which ultimately jumps a usual head injury. On top of that, the very next turn, when you split them again, it's going to be an extra 20% damage because of Executioner. So well paired together, causing massive effects. Other great perks that could have easily been in the spot is Duelist. Duelist has a plus 25% extra damage ignoring armor. That is fantastic. You pair that on an injured enemy, you're going to be doing great things. On top of that, Berserk, while I did put it in the Kryptonites, it's a very low end Kryptonite, because ultimately if you kill somebody in the first round, hit somebody in the next causing an injury, you're automatically getting that extra 4 from the kill earlier on. Still can work out fantastic. I could say a few of the masteries again, the dagger mastery is massive. Sword mastery is great because of the extra riposte ability being great for extra damage every time someone tries to hit you. Any of the other perks that make it easier to hit something is better. You know, of course, fast adaptation, backstabber, beautiful perks that make it much easier to consistently hit the enemy. Hopefully this helps you guys figure out what you want to do with this perk, whether it needs a combo or not. That's up for you to decide. Guys, if you do like this perk guide, please hit the like, subscribe so other people can see this as well. Hit that bell for when the next videos drop. There's a lot of other content like this on the channel, so stay tuned as it's going to get crazy this year for perk guides. Without further ado, I will see you in the next one. Bye!